Good afternoon. Mary, do we have a lavalier mic or not? I'll just have to shout.
The mic should be on, but...
Is it? Okay. Well, before I begin, I want to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for the kind invitation. I'm particularly grateful to you all coming out today, since this lecture coincides with the publication of my book, shown there. And so this lecture is tantamount to the launch of the book. During the Cold War from 1947 to 1991, the superpowers soon achieved a nuclear-armed stalemate that made any direct confrontation very dangerous, shifting their rivalry to surrogate conflicts in more remote battlegrounds like Southeast Asia. Sometimes the United States sent its own troops, as it did successfully, to the Dominican Republic in 1965. That's successfully, with quotes. From Washington's perspective, and disastrously to South Vietnam from 1965 to 1972. But most of the time, Washington dispatched individual CIA operatives armed with impunity to do whatever, and I mean whatever, they wanted to deflect Moscow's gambit and secure a contested terrain. Usually misfits, even oddballs at home, these consequential historical actors, whom I call men on the spot, often proved quite successful abroad as they fought for control of foreign capitals in places like Jakarta, Manila, Saigon, and Vientiane. Reflecting U.S. global hegemony, most of the men I identify in the book were Americans, but they are also joined in this invisible interstice of global politics by the British, Dutch, French, and Vietnamese operatives, all of whom played a surprisingly significant role in shaping the destiny of Southeast Asia as it emerged from colonial rule. In this talk, I will start with my creative process, and we historians, like every other person, we have our creative process. We don't like to talk about it because we're supposed to be these kind of impersonal conveyors of the past to the present, but we've got a process, so I want to talk about it. And then I want to move on to my analytical tools and conclude with a couple of case studies, and the number of case studies that I'll give you will depend on time, that bandit that steals all from us in the end. First, my process. As one of the earliest areas for Cold War rivalries, Southeast Asia also produced an extraordinary cadre of covert operatives, several of whom I interviewed for my first book titled The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which was published over 50 years ago, back in 1972. And in the course of that work all those years ago, I noted and wondered about the simultaneous appearance in the early 1950s of American, British, Dutch, and French counterinsurgency experts who seemed surprisingly influential in shaping the history of several Southeast Asian nations. But then I sort of put that aside, because it was just a random coincidence and didn't make too much of it back then. But now, for this book, placing those men on the spot in a global context led to the realization they were not only influential in their time and place, but they were also exemplars, archetypes of an important historical actor that has so far, or had so far, eluded other historians of the Cold War. Though attire in the costume of contemporary espionage, their modus operandi, as we'll see, and ultimately their global import, look surprisingly similar to that of the earlier builders of the British Empire, whom British imperial historians had called man on the spot, so I'm borrowing that term from them. Once I began looking for such historical actors, they kept arising. They kept kind of popping up from the documents on my page rather assertively until I had 30 of them populating my account. And at the back of my book, there's a tidy appendix when I list them all, and their biographical data. Next, let's move on to my second area, my analytical tools. To compress 50 years of Cold War history, spanning 5 continents, between 2 covers, is kind of an academic magic trick. And like all magic tricks, we have to have our devices. And I've got 3 devices that I'll talk about right now. So for today's focus on Southeast Asia, I'll be exploring the convergence of the way decolonization produced geopolitical ruptures in the world system that allowed individuals autonomy for consequential historical action. And that inflection named the 3 factors. So the first factor, geopolitics. To follow the Cold War's sweep across the globe, we need to don the 7-league boots of geopolitical analysis to leap from country to country, continent to continent, using this concept to explore the dynamics driving a relentless succession of local conflicts during the Cold War that killed 20 million people, making the Cold War the second most sanguinary, the second greatest incident of mass human mortality in history. At the high tide of the British Empire in 1904, an English geographer, Sir Alfred Mackinder, published an influential article that launched the modern study of geopolitics, and he, as you can see in this, he merged Asia, Africa, and Latin America into a single landmass that he called the World Island, and he marked this area the pivot area, which he also called the Heartland. At the end of World War I, Mackinder summarized those insights into a memorable maxim, and it goes like this: who rules the Heartland commands the World Island. Who rules the World Island commands the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, shown there playing chess with Menachem Begin at Camp David in 1978, applied Mackinder's theory in his foreign policy maneuvers and in his writing. Brzezinski is very much the intellectual acolyte of Mackinder. And here's what Zbigniew Brzezinski, at the end of the Cold War, how he summarized it, wrapped it all up. He said, quote, geopolitically, the struggle was for control over the Eurasian landmass. That's Mackinder's World Island. Each side understood the successful ejection of the one from the western and eastern fringes of Eurasia would ultimately determine the geostrategic outcome of the contest. To dominate Eurasia during the Cold War and contain the Sino-Soviet Communist bloc behind the Iron Curtain, Washington forged the NATO alliance at the western end of Eurasia in 1949, and over the next 5 years signed mutual defense pacts with 5 nations along the Pacific littoral, shown there more or less on that map: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Australia. Amidst the constant geopolitical struggle that marked the Cold War, a void sometimes opened in the world system, creating an opportunity, an opening for a mere human, an inherently inconsequential bit of biology, to somehow steer the direction of these overwhelmingly powerful geopolitical forces and influence the course of human history. Second factor, second tool for my magic trick, decolonization. These voids, these ruptures in the world system, usually came from the coincidence between the Cold War and the decolonization of Europe's colonial empires. By 1918, 10 imperial powers controlled 140 colonies that covered 40% of the Earth's land area and governed over 30% of the world's population. Instead of ending in the 1970s, as some scholars have argued, decolonization actually continued from 1946 to 1994, and thus it coincided absolutely precisely, it overlays exactly with the Cold War, which is 1947 to 1991. As anti-colonial struggles swept across the globe, decolonization acted kind of like a storm front, producing periodic maelstroms in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that open geopolitical ruptures, veritable voids in the world order that allows otherwise obscure covert operatives the autonomy to become a man on the spot. And just as colonization created opportunities for British imperial men on the spot to write their writ on world history, so decolonization allowed the emergence of their Cold War counterparts. That brings me to my third and final factor, the man on the spot. Both the Cold War and the preceding imperial age were influenced by individual actors, as we said, called men on the spot. Now, during the 19th century, London had a formal policy of non-expansion. The British Empire would not expand, and then we got that, okay? Okay, a third, 23% of the world's population, okay, governed by the British Empire. How did this happen? A British historian said that actually this contradiction between non-expansion as London's policy and the reality of expansion was the work of individuals whom British imperial historians call the man on the spot. So let's start with Southeast Asia. In 1839, this guy, James Brooks, sailed into his yacht into Kuching Harbor on the north coast of Borneo and soon became the White Raja of Sarawak, forming a private British colony that's survived for 101 years. by leading mercenaries against Messianic rebels near Shanghai in the 1860s. Charles Gordon, shown there in the uniform of a marshal or general in the Chinese Imperial Army, one renowned as Chinese Gordon, and he was later met his heroic death as Gordon of Khartoum that inspired the British conquest of Sudan. In Central Africa, the Diamond King, Cecil Rhodes, as in Rhodes Scholarship, dispatched 700 mercenaries armed with Maxim machine guns to cut down thousands of Matabele fighters, subduing a vast territory that he dubbed Rhodesia, which is now Zambia and Zimbabwe. As British influence expanded across the Middle East during World War I, a junior officer named T.E. Lawrence led an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and later, along with a rare woman on the spot, Gertrude Bell, shown there. That's Winston Churchill on the far left. That's Gertrude Bell in the lady's costume, and that's Lawrence Arabia next to him. Okay. So Lawrence helped his comrade, Prince Faisal, there in the center, become the first ruler of a British client state called the Kingdom of Iraq. Now, just as the expansion of empire created conditions for the emergence of these British men on the spot, so decolonization and the decline of empire allowed their latter-day Cold War counterparts to make their mark on world history. During the Cold War's frequent crises, 24 of these latter-day men on the spot turned up in cities scattered across 5 continents: in Athens, Jakarta, Manila, Saigon, Vientiane, Tehran, Kinshasa, Rwanda, Paris, and even Washington, D.C. And if we weave their biographical threads into an historical tapestry known as prosopography, or collective biography, among the 30 men on the spot active in the Cold War, 19 were born between 1908 and 1927. Almost all of those fought in World War II, thus forming a distinct generation that emerged battle-hardened for the extraordinary demands of a clandestine career. Reflecting the global reach of U.S. hegemony, as well as the bureaucratic style of Soviet espionage, 18 of these 30 operatives were Americans. Another 4 were French, another 4 were British, 4 more were from diverse backgrounds: Chilean, Cuban, Dutch, and Vietnamese. These ambitious, cunning, and often immoral Cold War operatives were usually marginal, even oddballs or misfits at home. But at fleeting moments of geopolitical rupture, usually caused by decolonization, when a veritable power vacuum opened to the world order, such obscure figures could attain sufficient autonomy, amplified by loose orders and limited oversight, to exercise an outside influence on the historical process. Now, I don't know if Juan's going to agree with me, and I hope he doesn't, because we historians are famously disputatious, and we're supposed to agree on about nothing. Our default mode of discourse is disagreement, okay? But I think, and one might argue, other historians might argue, but I think that there is one broad proposition that historians might agree on. That if you look at the complex, powerful forces, economic, ecological, that shape historical change, individuals, whether generals or kings or emperors, make no difference. They don't cause historical change. And I think that's a proposition that most historians, don't agree about anything, might agree with, okay? But in something as amorphous as human history, every rule has its exception, and I would argue this is one of them. Right at the outset of the Cold War, 2 individual covert operatives, this guy, Kermit Roosevelt, shown there on safari in Kenya in 1960, and Edward Lansdale in the Philippines. There's Edward Lansdale in the late 1940s. They scored 2 stunning victories, changing governments in frontline states on their own with no U.S. troops and no U.S. casualties. When Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, arrived back in Washington, D.C. after overthrowing a hostile nationalist government in Tehran, Iran in August 1953, he gave a briefing at the White House that made a profound impression on Dwight Eisenhower, still in his first year in office. Now, as Allied commander in Europe during World War II, then General Eisenhower had to sacrifice, and he was very mindful of this, the lives of 800,000 men to accomplish what? To change just 2 governments. Get rid of Benito Mussolini in Rome and Adolf Hitler in Berlin. That was it. 800,000 men lost to change two governments. Now, Kermit Roosevelt came back from the far-off Central Asia, and he changed the government, and he told Eisenhower only 300 lives were lost in the rioting in Tehran. I think that for Dwight Eisenhower, this was probably something of a miracle. You know, it took me 800,000 men to change a government, two governments in Europe, and this guy does it with 300 lives and no troops. And within a matter of months, similar CIA victories confirmed the efficacy of covert operations in fighting the Cold War. In Southeast Asia, the most famous covert operative of his day, Colonel Edward Lansdale, defeated communist guerrillas in the Philippines in 1953, and a year later overcame enormous odds to make his pro-American surrogate the leader in South Vietnam. And there's Lansdale in Manila right after World War II, Major Lansdale. And there he is in Saigon. He's the man doffing his cap. And Ngo Dinh Diem is on the right side of the photograph there in 1955 in Saigon. Almost simultaneously in Guatemala, the CIA scored another stunning success when its covert operatives toppled a left-wing reformist government that had confiscated U.S.-owned plantations and installed a reliable pro-American military dictator in the presidential palace. So in a little more than a year, this succession of CIA victories made covert action Washington's weapon of choice for fighting the Cold War, transforming the CIA from a minor intelligence unit into a major national security agency co-equal with the Pentagon and the State Department. Impressed by the efficacy of covert action, during his subsequent 7 years in office, President Eisenhower, who was, by the way, a career military officer, as we all know, ordered just one conventional military operation. In 1958, he sent troops to Lebanon. But he ordered 170 major covert operations, major covert interventions in 48 nations worldwide, thus making the CIA the source of U.S. force projection beyond the borders of the United States during the Cold War. Let's now move to my first historical case, the Philippines. In Southeast Asia, a tempestuous transition from colonialism to independence and from European empire to U.S. hegemony allowed ample opportunity for the emergence of the Cold War's most famous and notorious men on the spot. Amid this geopolitical rupture, Western covert operatives played an outsized role in the region's history, but only by the influence of similar clandestine actors during Africa's later decolonization. All were ruthless, a few were cunning, and one CIA operative sent to Manila and Saigon named Edward Lansdale was so successful he became a legend in his own time, celebrated in film and fiction. Now, as communist revolts erupted in Southeast Asia at the start of the Cold War, Lansdale became Washington's man on the spot in Manila and Saigon. Born in Detroit, educated at UCLA, where he dropped out after failing his foreign language requirement. Lansdale could not learn foreign languages. Lansdale joined the Office of Strategic Services, formerly the CIA, and spent most of World War II doing library research in San Francisco. At war's end in 1945, the U.S. Army shipped him to the Philippines, where he spent 2 years as Chief of Intelligence for the Western Pacific Command near Manila, observing local pacification efforts against an armed revolt by peasant guerrillas in central Luzon called the Hooks. After joining the U.S. Air Force in 1947, Lansdale stayed on in Manila as a public information officer, and he cultivated, and this was one of his attributes, an extraordinary network of elite Filipino contacts. And in his papers at the Hoover Institution, you can find 50 of the personal notes he wrote to his friends in Manila as he was being rotated home stateside in 1948. Future researchers note that even the most mundane of documents in our archive have their uses. While languishing behind a desk in Washington, D.C., Lansdale met a visiting Filipino congressman named Ramon Saysay, and Lansdale arranged a power lunch with top U.S. officials where the Filipino congressman spoke from Lansdale's script, impressing the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Far East so much that he flew off to Manila in August to insist that President Quirino, the Philippine president, appoint Saysay as Secretary of National Defense. Saysay, in turn, asked the U.S. mission to send him just 2 advisors for intelligence and psychological warfare, Colonel Lansdale of the Air Force and Colonel Charles Bohannon of the Army. Now, despite his inability to learn languages and so gain insight into foreign societies, Lansdale had an extraordinary ability to knit Americans and Filipinos into effective covert action teams and then take credit for all their work. That was one of his key attributes. His incessant search for allies, indigenous allies, local allies, would also open him to communist penetration, innocently, as we'll see in Manila, but disastrously in Saigon. Let's now turn to the Hook Revolt. When the Hook Revolt started in 1947, the ill-trained Philippines constabulary used a mailed fist strategy that killed countless villagers and alienated their communities. Demonstrating the failure of these tactics, on August 26, 1950, several thousand well-armed Hooks attacked a diagonal line of towns and military bases across the central Luzon plain. And here's just a couple of photos of central Luzon, give you an idea of the area we're talking about. The situation was so critical that President Carino, whoops, there he is. President Carino is a man sitting behind a microphone talking to the commander of the Hooks, Louis Turuk. President Carino kept a powerboat gassed up and manned 24 hours around the clock in front of Malacañang Palace in case the Hooks came into Manila, so he could hop in the powerboat and zoom across Manila Bay and get away from the communist guerrillas. The situation was bad. As the Cold War came to Asia in 1950, U.S. military advisors got the Philippine government to place the constabulary, the source of all those alienating abuses, under the defense secretary. Appointed defense secretary at this hour of crisis in September of 1950, McCoy cultivated a close relationship, and I mean close, with Edward Lansdale, lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force, whose rank was a cover for his work in the CIA. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, McCoy had grown up in central Luzon, the site of the Hook Revolt, and had served during World War II as commander. There's McCoy, and there's some Filipino guerrillas in central Luzon. He'd been commander of the largest anti-Japanese guerrilla force in his home province. So he not only was from central Luzon, he had experience of guerrilla warfare. McCoy is often overshadowed. He's really the key actor in this entire event. But the fact that we know about Lansdale, and he's famous, and nobody knows much about him, that's Lansdale's magic. Anyway, moreover, in November 1950, the U.S. National Security Council cited the country's geopolitical position, deciding to increase military aid to $117 million, which was substantial for that era. Under McCoy, the Philippine Army used the increased U.S. aid to launch counter-guerrilla campaign that began to beat the Hooks. With the support of his military advisors, McCoy transformed the armed forces into light mobile force with 26 battalion combat teams, or BCTs, of 1,000 men that could track the Hooks through the jungle and fight them barrel to barrel in this close order combat. And here's some photographs of the 7th Battalion Combat Team in training from Lansdale's papers. There they are, and there they are as combat forces in an operation, and there they are with their integrated artillery. The logic of the BCTs is each one was a mini mobile self-contained army. They had their own artillery, they had some light aircraft, they had some light armor, they had their own quartermaster corps. There were 26 little armies moving around the Philippines chasing the Hooks. That was the logic. Now, as you might imagine, when you attach a military unit from a hierarchy, the quality of the commander, who has this enormous autonomy, is very significant. And one thing about McCoy that was really exceptional is he would get up every morning and hop on a light aircraft and fly off to a command post and wake up the officers out of their tents. And if he didn't like what was going on, he'd fire. And he kept firing, and he kept firing all these reserve officers who had gotten incorporated in the military during World War II through political connections, were badly trained, most of them were incompetent, were incapable of commanding these BCTs. And by the time this process was done, McCoy had scraped away the reserve officers on the platoon. He'd gotten down to the regulars who were competent graduates of the Philippine Military Academy, particularly the first large graduating class of 1940. Okay? And so half the BCTs were commanded by the alumni, the 70-plus guys who graduated from the Philippine Military Academy in 1940. Advised by Colonel Charles Bohannon, who had quit the anthropology PhD program at Harvard at the start of World War II, Lansdale's CIA team applied cultural cyber tactics to successfully demoralize the Hook rebels. And here's a photograph. That's Bohannon on the left, McCoy in the middle. Note the way McCoy is got his American skin close, right? Okay. And this is Frank Wisner, okay, the head of CIA covert operations during the Cold War. Okay, very powerful figure. Now, as a politician deeply familiar with Central Luzon, McCoy realized that much of the peasant anger towards the government was political and won their support in bringing services to the farmers. Under these pressures from within and without, the Hook communist revolt began to collapse. In 1954, the Hook Supremo, shown there, Louis Taruk with his security squad, was alienated from the rigid ideology of the Communist Party, and he surrendered to a young Filipino journalist named Nino Aquino, whose name, of course, is on the airport when you land at Manila these days. Famous for all sorts of reasons. That's the subject of probably another discussion. Anyway, as the Hook units weakened in 1953, McCoy resigned his defense post to accept the presidential nomination of the Nationalist Party, with Colonel Lansdale secretly supervising his electoral propaganda and managing his fundraising campaign that got $1 million from U.S. corporations. The McCoy campaign changed the face of Philippine politics, and McCoy became an international figure during the day through Lansdale's Psy-war manipulations. Instead of meeting with the landlords in their big houses surrounding the plazas, McCoy donned the everyman's barong Tagalog to plunge into the barrios, thereby taking his campaign directly to the people while promising land reform and rural development, in effect stealing the thunder of the Hooks. And here's McCoy campaigning. Faced with a threat of electoral fraud from the incumbent President Quirino, shown here campaigning, Lansdale advised Washington that McCoy supporters in the Philippine military were planning a coup to install McCoy in office should he lose the vote. He said that he had the cream of the Philippine officer corps, which could only be the class of 1940, involved in the project. Now, unbeknownst to Lansdale, and not only to me, when I decided to write a book about the class of 1940 and interviewed all the surviving members of the class, they had been indoctrinated in the idea of civil supremacy and an honor code, and they all took that very, very seriously. So they heard about these rumors of a coup, and they got together and they decided, we're not going to say anything, but if the orders come down, we're not moving. There will be no coup. In the November 1953 balloting, McCoy won such a resounding victory over Quirino that the coup was not needed, and Lansdale remained oblivious to his error. Through cultural manipulation, his close alliance with McCoy and recruitment of an extraordinary double agent, which I'll talk about in just a second, Lansdale gained an extraordinary sense of mastery over the Philippines that made him an empowered man on the spot, seemingly capable to himself and to his superiors in Washington of bending any society to his will through psychological warfare, whether in the Philippines, South Vietnam, or later in Cuba. When he was dying of cancer years later, I had an interview with Colonel Charles Bohannon, who told me a story illustrative of how deep Lansdale's sense of mastery over the Philippines had become. And I've checked it out with other sources, and the details may be a bit off, but the story is basically as much as one can determine the facts of the matter. Now, the story went like this. Okay, when Lansdale was an intelligence officer, I said earlier, there was a serious leak inside the presidential palace. As the commander-in-chief of the Philippine Army, the president of the Philippines was briefed on all upcoming major offensive operations. And those plans were leaking from the presidential palace to the Hooks and compromising the element of surprise. So Lansdale, according to Bohannon, salted documents around the palace, each one stating that there'd be something like a cavalcade, lightly guarded, carrying arms and money at such a time and place. And then there were watcher squads scattered around those times and places. And when a Hook ambush popped up in a certain time and place, They knew which document had been stolen and who was the thief, and therefore the communist spy inside the presidential palace. Within days, those reports indicated that the communist agent was a young woman named Patricia Petrosino Kelly. Lansdale extracted a confession, turned her into one of his agents, and here they are together. To Pat, Love, Ed, 1951. To me, I don't know about you, but it looks like the morning after the night before. Over coming months, Pat Kelly provided the hooks with false intelligence reports, setting them up for bloody ambushes by government troops. A quarter century later, after the deaths of their respective spouses, the retired CIA agent and the former communist spy married and settled in Virginia. It would be this second Mrs. Lansdale who buried the quiet American. There's Lansdale's grave with his first wife, Helen Lansdale, and there, right next door, is Patrocino Lansdale, her grave as well. Celebrated in fiction and two feature films, Lansdale became an almost legendary figure whose clandestine triumphs contributed to the mystique of covert operations, making them Washington's main means of force projection during the Cold War. Let's move to case number 2 for Southeast Asia in South Vietnam. Well, when the Geneva Conference ended the French Indochina War in 1954, CIA Director Alan Dulles, the man on the left, sent Edward Lansdale to Saigon undercover to prevent South Vietnam from going communist. Instead of detailed instructions, Alan's brother, the other man in that photograph, the guy on the right, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, told Lansdale simply, "I want you to do what you did in the Philippines." A brief so broad that Lansdale had ample autonomy to become Washington's man on the spot in Saigon. Adding to this autonomy, the 1954 Geneva Agreement had suspended Vietnam's sovereignty for 2 years. Okay, what do we mean by suspended sovereignty? In 1954, at the Geneva Agreement, they said that in 2 years, in 24 months, there would be a plebiscite to determine the form of government in South Vietnam. And until that time, the sovereignty was suspended, and there was an international commission called the International Control Commission that was supposed to manage the affair of this void in the world system, this place without sovereignty. Okay? And that was this geopolitical rupture that amplified Lansdale's autonomy and allowed him to act as a man on the spot. Landing at Saigon in May 1954, knowing nothing about No Dinh Diem, and remember, Lansdale flunked French at UCLA, and French was the lingua franca among the officer corps and the political elite in Saigon. Except for probably a couple of mispronounced words, he couldn't. So he was monolingual, innocent abroad in Saigon. And he met No Dinh Diem, the new prime minister, and Lansdale quickly decided that Diem was an ideal anti-communist ally, if you will, a Vietnamese McCoy. And there's Lansdale behind and Diem in the center. To reinforce Diem's shaky rule, Lansdale, though still a lowly lieutenant colonel, would have to defeat a formidable array of opponents, including a French military determined to preserve its post-colonial influence, a pro-French crime syndicate called the Bin Swin Bandits that ruled Saigon, a U.S. local diplomatic mission dubious about Diem, and above all, senior officials in Washington, D.C. who had real doubts about Diem's capacity for leadership. By March 1955, however, Lansdale's covert manipulations had won over Vietnam's army and most of the armed religious sect militias in the Mekong Delta, leaving the French with just one reliable ally. The Bin Swin Bandits, whose 9,000 armed men controlled the Saigon netherworld of opium dens, gambling casinos, and brothels, rendering them immune to the CIA's fiscal manipulations. But by then, very importantly, this man on the left there, Lightning Joe, Lieutenant General, now Lieutenant General, okay, 4 stars, okay? And who is Edward Lansdale? Lieutenant Colonel, okay? It's Lord and peasant, okay, in a military hierarchy, right? When a lieutenant general walks into a room in Washington, D.C., the air just sucks out of the room. I mean, this guy's a lord of the earth, okay? And he was also one of Eisenhower's staff officers, top staff officers, during the campaign in Europe in World War II. So Eisenhower and Lightning Joe were buddies, okay? Eisenhower became Chief of Staff of the U.S. The U.S. Army, Lightning Joe, became Chief of Staff. And Eisenhower, knowing this was a sensitive area, he sent a man he could trust, Lieutenant General Lightning Joe Collins, who was NATO commander, detach him from NATO, send him to Saigon as his special representative. And Collins had been there for about 5 months, and he'd come to one conclusion, that Ziem was outrageously incompetent. Okay? He just couldn't do it. And he sent messages, diplomatic cables to Washington, stating this over and over. Called back to Washington for consultation. General Collins excoriated Ziem's leadership, saying he had, quote, demonstrated such a marked inability to understand the political, economic, and military problems associated with Vietnam. And this criticism caused Secretary of State John Foster Dulles on April 27, 1955, to cable U.S. officials in Paris and Saigon saying, get ready for a change in government. Ziem is out. Okay? But within hours of that cable, Lansdale went to the presidential palace, and together the two of them ordered the Vietnamese army to drive the Binh Xuyen bandits out of Saigon, sparking 5 days of intense house-to-house combat. In the end, the bandits were routed and Ziem became master of the city, prompting Secretary of State John Foster Dulles to cable the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, hailing Ziem as, quote, a popular hero, a symbol of Vietnamese nationalism, whose removal would be, quote, highly detrimental to our prestige in Asia. That victory made Edward Lansdale the most famous CIA operative of the Cold War, whose clandestine entries were celebrated in 3 feature films. Here's The Quiet American, the original one. Lansdale was involved in writing the script and picking the locations. And he's played by Audie Murphy, the great American hero from World War II. And then here's another Lansdale figure, Marlon Brando, playing the Lansdale character in The Ugly American, one of the worst books ever published in America, and probably one of the worst films ever made by Hollywood. Certainly Marlon Brando's worst role, and you get a lot of them. And then finally, The Quiet American, with somebody more familiar to us, a young Brendan Fraser, many pounds shy of himself today, playing the young Edward Lansdale figure. Simultaneously, however, another of Lansdale's less visible protégés, recruited and promoted with his same empowered hubris, would later become Hanoi's top spy in Saigon and do incalculable damage to the later U.S. war effort in South Vietnam. And that takes me to case number 3, Saigon during the Vietnam War, 1962 to 75. Now, here I'm going to go way out on a limb, all right? Viewed broadly, just my view, the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1975 was divided into 2 key domains: conventional infantry combat, which the U.S. won, and the CIA's counter-terror campaign, which suffered a sub rosa defeat, becoming, I would argue, the key reason the United States lost the Vietnam War. Simply put, Hanoi's efficient counterintelligence defeated the CIA's attempt at uprooting the Viet Cong, or VC, communist underground, through a massive counter-terror apparatus, the CIA's Phoenix program that executed 41,000 suspected communists and tortured countless thousands, probably tens of thousands more. Now that raises a kind of critical question that's not raised in any of the thousands upon thousands of books on the Vietnam War. And very simply, I think we should ask, how could a CIA program kill 41,000 suspected communists and torture many thousands more without destroying the enemy's underground? In a 1969 study of enemy counterintelligence, the CIA found that the communist Viet Cong had infiltrated 30,000 communist spies into every facet of Saigon's security services, making this what the CIA called, quote, by far the biggest agent network in the history of espionage. I discovered the sophistication of communist counterintelligence through the accident of personal connections. Now, when I was a sophomore at a small New England boarding school in the early 1960s, I was on the junior varsity wrestling team, and the captain of the varsity was a guy named John Merson. Here he is. That's his memoir, and that's John, as a Marine Lance Corporal in South Vietnam. He dropped out of Amherst College, and he wound up in Vietnam as a Marine Lance Corporal leading a squad of Marines in village pacification efforts. In a memoir titled War Lessons, shown right there, Merson, in this passage here, you don't have to read it, I'll read it for you. He recalled that his unit, quote, received a report of Viet Cong traveling downriver in our direction. So shortly after midnight, Merson's Marines, quote, fired automatic rifles, machine guns, and grenade launchers, creating a killing zone that slaughtered all 20 people in the boats on the river. Now, the intelligence had been accurate in every detail. The place, the movement, okay, and the time, and the day. Everything was right except one little detail. The people in the boats were not Viet Cong soldiers, but they were, Merson wrote, unarmed women, children, and old men. Okay? Now, before he published that book in 2008, John Merson, because he heard I was teaching a course in the Vietnam War, and he sent me the manuscript for review. And at Christmas, we were on vacation with the family in Bermuda, and we're sitting on a beach, and I was at the end of the table with my stepfather, who was a retired Marine colonel. And during the Vietnam War, there was General William Westmoreland, Chief Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and he had 4 staff units with 4 staff commanders. G1, okay, G2, intelligence, and under G2, the Deputy Chief of Intelligence in South Vietnam, in his last assignment in his 30-year Marine career, was my stepfather, Colonel Kruger L. Bright. So, knowing that this was a story from a Marine Lance Corporal, and Kruger had served in Vietnam, that he might be interested, I told him this story about my schoolmate who was involved in this horrible massacre. And as soon as I finished telling the story, like bang, like that, Kruger goes bang, like that. He says, good counterintelligence by the enemy. I said, what? What do you mean, Kruger? He said, villagers hated Americans. Marines demoralized, win-win by the enemy. So that started me thinking, okay? Now, if a local Viet Cong militia could defeat a skilled Marine squad, led by a very smart man, Merson later earned an MBA from Harvard Business School and became an innovator at IBM, with such sophisticated counterintelligence, what could the real communist intelligence professionals accomplish with those 30,000 spies? In a major study of Viet Cong intelligence in late 1969, the lead CIA analyst, the head of Order Battle Intelligence in the CIA, a man named Samuel Adams, found the Viet Cong had those 30,000 spies inside the Saigon government who were, quote, running parts of the national police, controlled the counterintelligence branch of the South Vietnamese Military Security Service, and listen to this is freaking amazing, and that in several areas of Vietnam, the Viet Cong were in charge of our own Phoenix program. Hold it. The Phoenix program, that's the one that killed 41,000 people, tortured countless tens of thousands to wipe out the communists, and the Viet Cong have taken over the Phoenix program in certain areas, okay? Remember what my stepfather said, good counterintelligence by the enemy, because that's what counterintelligence always does. When you've got enemy spies operating in your territory, and from a Vietnamese perspective, South Vietnam was sovereign Vietnamese territory, your counterintelligence identifies the operation and flips it, okay? So the British did to German spies in World War II, in the double-cross system, it's what good counterintelligence. The Russians did it against our spies during the Cold War, let them come in, go around, make all the contacts around, no, torture them, kill them all, okay? That's what good counterintelligence does. And by the way, in the Cold War, it's an incidental note, hypothesis. Whenever U.S. intelligence came up against Soviet or Soviet-trained counterintelligence, the Soviets won and we lost. It's pretty consistent, okay? Okay, anyway, in effect, communist counterintelligence, like all good counterintelligence, had flipped the Phoenix program, making it a killing machine that destroyed and damaged our own war effort. Some of those 30,000 spies proved to be extraordinarily skilled operatives, particularly a Time magazine reporter, this man named Phan Xuan An, who was Hanoi's man on the spot in Saigon and provided North Vietnam with intelligence critical for almost all of its major military victories during the Vietnam War. After induction into the Communist Party in 1953, Phan Xuan An infiltrated the headquarters of the South Vietnamese military in 1955. There he met CIA operative Edward Lansdale, who Lansdale began teaching him intelligence tradecraft. He arranged that the CIA front organization, the Angel Society, give Phan Xuan An a scholarship, and Phan Xuan An, with travel money from the Communist Party and with a scholarship from the CIA, went to study for a year at Orange Coast College near Los Angeles. And there's a lot of writing about Phan Xuan An, but from our area studies perspective, think about what we do with our students. We teach them a language and we send them abroad, and they immerse themselves in a foreign society, and they begin to understand how that society operates, and they come back and they write up. And he goes, well, you're really complicated in the back and forth now. And you go, I'll leave that one behind. Anyway, so we generally, the program, the way it usually works is we take Americans, we teach them language, we acculturate them, we drop them down in foreign societies, they become acculturated, they understand how those societies actually operate, the folkways, the culture, the meaning of the words behind the printed words, and gain this cultural sensitivity. And that's what happened to Phan Xuan An. He began to understand Americans and American mentality. Through his contacts with South Vietnamese officials and American journalists like Robert Chaplin, that's Robert Chaplin right there, and the man whispering in his ear is Phan Xuan An. And that's a very famous portrait by Richard Avedon, part of an exhibit in which these giant portraits, this is in the Metropolitan Museum art exhibit, it was the size of this wall, okay? And there's Phan Xuan An. He was so deep undercover that they picked him for that. Chaplin was very close to the CIA in Saigon, and Phan Xuan An compiled, we believe, 498 intelligence reports that were sent to Hanoi and were critical for most of Hanoi's major victories in the Vietnam War. In March 1975, Hanoi launched a tank attack on Ba Me Thuot city in central Vietnam, which Phan's intelligence had identified as particularly vulnerable, precipitating the sudden South Vietnamese retreat and the fall of Saigon. After he resigned as the last Saigon bureau chief for Time magazine in 1976, Hanoi rewarded him with 16 medals, each one for one of his contributions to a major Vietnamese victory. They gave him a rank of general, and that's Phan Xuan An there with his general stars on his epaulets. Now let's sum things up. All these stories from Southeast Asia raise an important question for us as historians. What do these anecdotes add to our analytical framework for understanding the role of the man on the spot? First, from these stories about Phan Xuan An and Colonel Lansdale, I think it's fair to conclude that first, espionage played a determinative role in the outcome of the Vietnam War, which was a major chapter in the Cold War. Second, the man on the spot may well have shaped the course of that outcome in Vietnam and indeed the Cold War more broadly. Third, it is clear that these men on the spot not only acted, but they interacted with each other in that intelligence interspace, which I call the covert netherworld, in ways that often had profound consequences for the clandestine mission. Not only, for example, did Lansdale secure Saigon for Washington in 1955, but he also gave a local asset, Phan Xuan An, training that allowed him to become such a formidable communist spy. Finally, as a foreign operative dropped Deus Ex Machina into an alien society, the man on the spot needed local allies like Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines or Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon to use as a kind of Archimedean lever to lift the society in the desired direction. Embodying the power of an empire, such agents could readily attract influential locals, Diem, Magsaysay. Indeed, it was their role, the role of the men on the spot, as political brokers between those allies and a far-off imperial capital that gave them that autonomy of action, arguably their defining feature as historical actors. More broadly, following these men on the spot into their clandestine shadowlands reminds us that empire and the clash of empires that was the Cold War was and is a very dirty business. Indeed, the Cold War's covert interventions, which these men embodied, relied on the cruelest instruments in the toolkit of modern statecraft: assassination, psychological manipulation, mass murder, torture, terror, and surrogate warfare. Thank you.